Hello again, PodB students. This is Mrs. Buckingham, and today we are going to talk about oligopolies. So we're still working through those market structures from Chapter 7. We're on Chapter 7, Section 3 at this point. What is an oligopoly and how does it limit competition? So remember, we've been talking about market structures and we've been looking at their four characteristics, looking at how many producers are there, what type of products, what are the barriers to entry, and how much control do producers have over prices. So far we have talked about perfect competition, which would allow the most competition. It's on that far end of the spectrum. And then we talked about monopolies, which is on the complete other end of the spectrum, the least competitive. Okay, today we are going to talk about oligopolies. So we're right here. We're closer to monopolies, but there is still some competition. More competition than a monopoly, but clearly not as much competition as there would be in a perfectly competitive market structure. So by definition, an oligopoly is a market or an industry that's dominated by just a few firms. And they're going to produce products that are pretty similar. They might even be close to identical in some circumstances. When we talked about monopolies, we talked about how for the most part they're relatively rare. Oligopolies are a market structure that are quite common in today's economy. So anytime you're taking a domestic, like a commercial airline flight, you're buying a car, you're consuming soda, all of the companies that compete in those markets are oligopolies. There's really just a few big producers of those types of products that dominate the market. And that's kind of what we're going to look at today. So when we talk about those four characteristics that we'd be looking for in those in that market structure. In an oligopoly, we have few producers. Like I mentioned on the last screen, there's only a small number of firms that control the market. So basically, an industry is considered an oligopoly if the four top producers together supply more than 60% of the total output. So that means that those few companies they have over 60% of control of that market or more. And we'll look at a couple of examples in a couple minutes. There'll be companies that you're relatively familiar with. And if you think about it, you can see that there's really not much competition beyond those big brands. The other characteristic is that they have similar products. So I also mentioned that on the last slide. Producers in an oligopoly offer basically the same product. There might be minor variations. Light bulbs are another example of an oligopoly. The companies that create light bulbs, there's only a few of them, and light bulbs are relatively similar. They might have different wattages or different sizes, but basically a light bulb is a light bulb. Same goes with kitchen appliances, soap, computer chips, soda, we mentioned before. Think about Coke and Pepsi. Yes, you might have a preference of one over the other. You might think that one tastes different than the other, but essentially they're nearly the same thing. Okay, so we've got Google and Microsoft, Apple, they're all creating a similar product. When it comes to barriers of entry, this is where an oligopoly is pretty similar to a monopoly in that there are high barriers to entry. It's really hard for a new firm to break into an oligopoly and compete. Again, if we think of soda as an example, you've got your big soda producers, you've got Coke and Pepsi, you've got Dr. Pepper and Snapple are owned by the same company. They're a group. And really all the variations of soda that you can think of pretty much fall into those categories. To be a new competitor, to come out with some kind of brand new soda beverage, it's really going to have to stand out. And there's going to be a really high startup cost to be able to compete with those big producers. And then the last characteristic that we would look at is control over prices. In an oligopoly, they don't have complete control because there is still competition. Coke is still competing against Pepsi, but they're going to have more control than you would if you were a farmer in a perfectly competitive market structure. You don't have as many people that you're competing with. So as far as examples go, we could take a look at this slide and take a look at some major examples, things that you're probably familiar with. If you walk down the aisles in the grocery store to buy breakfast cereal, for example, you're basically going to find the four big brands. You've got General Mills, you've got Post, you've got Kellogg, and you've got Quaker. and Quaker is actually owned by Pepsi. So those are kind of your big four cereal producers, and they basically control 85% of the US market for cereal. If you just decided out of the blue that you were going to, as an entrepreneur, you're going to create your own cereal, it's going to be a hard time to compete with these guys. You might have smaller, more homemade, smaller lines, but to get that mass produced in all the supermarket shelves and to be able to offer it at prices that would be competitive with these four companies would be really difficult. So that's an example of those high barriers to entry. Another example, we mentioned soda before. So you've got Coke, Pepsi, and like I said, you've got Dr. Pepper, Snapple group. And again, they control the market. Although there's other companies that could be a part of that industry, there's other beverages, other brands of soda, they're not going to be able to have the impact on the market like these big companies do. So, when firms in an oligopoly compete for customers, the result can be a pretty competitive market. However, oligopolies more often behave like monopolies. So rather than lower their prices to try to win a bigger share of the market, firms in an oligopoly might actually choose to drive their prices up to levels beyond market equilibrium price. And there's a couple different ways that they can do this. So we've got price leadership, collusion, and cartels. One of these is a perfectly legal and often used method in the US economy. The other two are technically illegal in the United States, but sometimes happen. So we'll talk about each of them individually. So let's start by talking about price leadership. Price leadership is this idea that when in an oligopoly that's dominated by a single company, that firm might try to control prices through price leadership. So if they're a really popular company, they kind of lead the market, they're the dominant firm, they're basically setting the price for that product, and the other smaller firms are going to follow suit. If that industry leader sets the price too high, the other firms benefit because consumers are going to buy that lower price product. We talked about that. That's that concept of supply and demand. Sometimes, however, that dominant firm might cut their prices to try to take business away from its competitors or even force them out of business. And then if those other firms also lower their prices, you might experience a price war. Price wars are going to be really bad and difficult on the producer, but that is when consumers, we often benefit from a price war because we're going to get those companies when they compete with each other like that. We're going to benefit when those prices come down. A second type of cooperative pricing is collusion. So collusion is an agreement, in which producers cooperate on production levels and pricing. Collusion is illegal because it's unfairly limiting competition, but firms do sometimes try to get around the law. Apple and some book publishing companies were accused of collusion in 2013, that they were negotiating with each other to drive prices up. If companies get caught doing that, they can be brought to court. They can have consequences. You're not supposed to do that. You're really supposed to let the market regulate itself. And then the third type of cooperative pricing is a cartel or cartel formation. Cartels are a group of producers whose goal is to work together to set production and price levels for a product. Again, in the United States economy, cartels are illegal. They're not supposed to operate that way, but they do often operate on the global scale. And we see this most often in commodities. So nations that produce coffee, sugar, some natural resources like tin have all tried to form cartels in the past. And actually one of the best known modern cartels is OPEC. And OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And it's about a dozen countries that work together to set quotas on oil production and exports. And by setting limits on the supply of oil, they have a ton of influence over what those oil prices are going to be, and everybody is kind of tied to that. So when companies or cartels, I should say, in that situation, it's a group of companies. When they have market power like that, it's going to have potentially harmful effects on the consumer. when a firm and an oligopoly works together to control the market, they're acting like that monopoly. They're setting those prices, and that really limits the amount of flexibility and lower prices that consumers have access to. It's also keeping the market from being efficient, and it's keeping those producers from having to be more innovative or responsive to consumer demands. So that is oligopoly. Again, to kind of go back, remember your 4 characteristics. It's here on this spectrum. You can see that oligopolies, again, are going to be on that less competitive edge, not as little competition as in a monopoly where they're the sole provider, but you've got a few producers creating highly similar or almost identical products, very difficult to get into the market as a new producer, and they have some control over prices. Thanks for listening. See you next time.